welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. For this sweet pea lesson, I would prefer that you use a hot press paper. I found that the sweet peas look so much more delicate and transparent on the hot press. I tried them on my usual favourite Arches 140 cold pressed, and the texture of the paper seemed to really grab onto the paint, and they looked not as delicate and transparent as I would have liked. I started with some sketches of the sweet peas from my garden and some little studies, and for this series of lessons I'd really like to focus on studies, looking carefully at the items that we're going to paint and painting them in detail and just small paintings so that you understand. The leaves on my wild sweet peas were quite long, and the leaves which are dried on my cultivated sweet peas were more rounded. Here's the dried ones that I found, so they were quite different in shape. And that's something when you're doing a study that you can work on, observing the different shapes of different varieties of plants and leaves. And the stems also were very flat. So I'm going to be using permanent rose, quinacridone magenta, dioxazine purple, and I'm going to mix the purple using my quinacridone magenta with some blues, some cerulean blue or one of the cool blues. And this very first part of my vase of sweet peas, I'm using very, very watery, loose brush strokes just to put down a lovely loose layer. And this is some of my permanent rose and also the stronger quinacridone magenta. They will all dry much lighter than this. I want to keep the sweet peas looking beautifully delicate and transparent. And I'm using a big mop brush to do that, quill mop. You don't have to do a background. I did do a background for these pictures, but you don't have to. You can keep them on white if you would prefer. And I've used thin masking tape that I got from Home Hardware. It's for masking off the grout lines in a floor. It's quite narrow and it's lovely for just separating your studies on a piece of paper. This one is 9 by 12, 8 by 10 or 9 by 12. You can either use a big piece that's sectioned off, or you can use some little pieces of paper if you like. I quite like the small blocks of fluid paper. They are gummed on two sides, which keeps them nice and flat. They're cotton and they're 140 pounds. They're not as good as Arches paper, but for convenience and just usefulness, they're very good. They're one of my preferred papers if I'm not using Arches, and especially if I want to take paper with me in my traveling bag. I'm tapping my brush to spread a little splatter around because I just like that look. And I've already done, previously to recording this, I've done a little study of two of the sweet peas actually from my garden, and now I'm going to work on the violet one. So I'm using dioxazine violet or dioxazine purple. The different brands will call it either purple or violet, and I'm using it pretty neat as it comes. Sometimes I'm going to mix some permanent rose with it. Sometimes I'm going to mix some cobalt blue with it to cool it down a little bit. And you can see I'm mixing a lot of water to keep that transparent light look to the edges of the leaves. I work in layers on these, because if you try and put down a very deep color at the very start, it will become just too dense and not delicate and tissuey enough for the petals. You need to work it up in layers. And also you can control the paint much better if you work in several light layers. You can get those lovely sort of washed back areas. You use just water with them. Now I'm going a little darker. I've mixed a little bit of ultramarine blue with my D-violet. I'm going to call that dioxazine violet D-violet. It's too much of a mouthful. So I've mixed some ultramarine blue with that to darken it up a little bit. And you might be able to see the contrast where I've mixed some permanent rose with it in the lighter parts of the petals. I'm letting this work wet in wet. It's a lovely way to get soft edges on these petals. The folds at the top of the petals I'm leaving dry, And that way when I come and paint them, when the rest of it's dry, they will have a distinct edge and it will look like a separate part of the petal, even if it's a very similar colour. So I've just got a wet brush and I'm blending in those shadows very carefully, not too much water. And now I've mixed a little bit of rose with my violet and I'm painting the other part of the second petal there. It's lovely to mix up your colours, a little bit of rose, a little bit of cerulean blue, a little bit of cobalt blue to give warm and cool tones, even if you're doing a violet flower. Now I have mixed up a very light green. I love green gold. It's one of my core colours that I bought and use a lot, but you don't have to use green gold. I've mixed it with a tiny bit of azo yellow, but you can mix a bright green with Windsor yellow, azo yellow, cadmium yellow, mix it with a little bit of phthalo blue or phthalo green or hooker's green or ultramarine blue. You can mix a lot of different greens, but I like to put the light one on first, even though the stem is quite dark. I put the dark shadow. The stems are very flat on the sweet peas. They have sort of a core that is hard and round, and then they have a flat piece on either side. They're very interesting. And that's what I mean about doing a study. It's really looking closely at what you're painting and observing everything about it. I've mixed some azo yellow with my green to make it really bright, to paint the leaves coming from the... This is where one of the flowers has fallen off. And I'm painting with a small number 2 brush so that I can really get the detail nice and fine. There's a definite contrast between when I started on the vase of flowers and I was loose with a great big brush. It was a number 4 mop brush, and I sort of splattered stuff around, and I'm waiting for that to dry. That's what's nice. If you're doing these little studies, you can work on another one while the other painting dries. And oh, I forgot to say, I masked using masking fluid. I masked some highlights on the glass vase, and I masked some highlights on the flowers too with masking fluid before I started. And I'm going with a little bit more shadow under that folded petal. And every layer I put on is just a slightly different violet. I may have mixed a little blue with it, a little pink, just so there's a lot of different colours going on, and I'm adding water and a little bit of that green gold to sort of stain the edge of the flower a little bit green as it comes off of the leaves that hold it. I don't quite know what that's called. The little leaf cup where the flower is held before it opens. And then when it opens, it has 5 petals or leaves fold back and support the flower. As this one, in a moment when this one starts to dry, it gives me some time to let it dry before I finish it off, I will work on the vase of flowers again. And when I come in to do the glass full of water, I will use a small brush and some very careful painting, not the sloppy sort of slapdash, throw the paint around start that I did to the painting. And I tried that previously and I found that I couldn't do that. I couldn't do a lovely loose painting until I had really studied the flowers and painted them realistically and tried to find out what they really looked like, not just an impression. It's very hard to do an impressionistic painting if you don't know exactly what it is you are trying to make an impression of. And I found I just made a mess when I didn't really understand the shapes of the flowers, or how the petals folded back, or how they formed that kind of a heart shape, the back petals. And that's also why I did quite a few sketches. Just I'd held the flower and I pulled it open, pulled it back. So now I'm working on the vase again. This is all dry. And I've mixed ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, lots of blue because I want it very grey, and I've mixed a little bit of the permanent rose with it so it has some continuity with the whole painting. And I'm using that with my number 2 brush to very carefully paint the shadows in the water and paint between the stems. I took a photograph of my sweet peas in the vase and I printed it out so I can hold it there and look carefully at the shapes of the shadows. And what I'm looking at is shapes. Where do they form a triangle? Where is there sort of a rectangle? Or what shapes are those shadows forming? And if you don't get them correct, your painting will look a little bit off. But if you do get those shapes correct, it will read perfectly as water in a glass vase. There was a very, very dark shadow at the bottom of the vase where the glass is thick at the bottom. And of course the bottom is circular, so you have to have that elliptical shape to show that the bottom of the vase is circular. And I've added a little bit more blue, made the shadows darker on this side as they were on the photo and in real life. It's interesting that if you're painting water in a glass, it's not always light and transparent. You can show the transparency and the wateriness of it by having these lovely, lovely, very dark shadows to contrast with the bright highlights. And don't forget, cobalt blue is a very beautiful light blue that you can use to do the water areas that are not dark. Very pretty blue, not strong. I'm using a little bit of it there. Remember to use a lot of water with your paint. I'm using a little bit of the green to reflect the leaves and reflect the stems. And while that's wet, I'm putting in some much darker blue-green using ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue is a great one for shadows and darkening up your paint, especially if you're doing a grey. Be careful if you're mixing ultramarine blue with burnt sienna to make a grey that you don't use too much burnt sienna, or you're just going to have a brown, kind of an unpleasant brown. It won't look like the warm grey shadows in the water that you are aiming for. So make it heavy on the blue, and by adding a little bit of rose into it, that will help reflect the pinks from your sweet peas. And see, I'm going very carefully in between the stems. I will paint the stems when this paint is dry. Now at this point my background behind the flowers is white, and it's perfectly fine to leave it like that. It looks quite nice white, but I am going to put in a very, very light green background as a complementary colour to the pink. And because I want at the end of the painting, I want the borders between these three studies to stand out white where I've put the tape. And that's really the only reason that I'm going to put a background in. I quite like it just white. I'm going in with some pure quinacridone magenta to put some nice deep shadows on the petals, just to pick some out from that wet in wet mass of petals that I did. And I drew them very, very carefully. I drew them with two things. I drew them with a watercolor pencil in different colors. I have some nice, lovely watercolor pencils. And I also have a graphite pencil that sort of dissolves in water so that you can see some of it, and some of it just sort of melts into the background. And I don't mind seeing the pencil lines. I think they look lovely, especially behind a very loose painting. Now I'm painting in the green stems. I had to skip ahead. I can't get everything into this video. It's not possible. So I've skipped ahead a little bit. I also, as you've seen, put some purple shadows into the flowers, into the petals. And now I've mixed up a green using azo yellow and ultramarine blue and hooker's green. Make it nice and strong. And this light green I'm using behind the flowers is mostly green gold with a little bit of azo yellow in it. Very, very light. I'm putting it on with water, and then a little bit of the purple into the shadow there. Wet and wet. I kind of really like these loose wet in wet shadows. I think there's a nice contrast between the careful painting of the vase and the shadows, which were painted very realistically and very carefully, with very little wet in wet, and then my shadows and my flowers and the background very loose. And I've left a little bit of the vase completely white paper on the right hand side there. And of course the shadow cast by the vase and the flowers, that needs to be there. I'm painting the corners a little bit darker. It's just so that it focuses you in on the flowers. And I'm wetting some and just dabbing out a little bit of colour. Pretty hard to do because actually the D-violet and the quinacridone magenta are pretty staining colours. So when you use the staining colour, it's very hard to wash them back. If I had mixed my purple with the permanent rose and cobalt blue, they would have been easy to wash back. Those colours don't stain. I'm putting a few more darks into the shadows. Again, the same mixture, the ultramarine blue, the burnt sienna, a little bit of the permanent rose, a little bit of the green or violet, probably a little bit of the violet, if I remember correctly. I basically used very limited palette on these three paintings, and that unifies them. Now I'm going back to paint those folds over the petals with a very watery violet and deepening the shadows a little bit. I have a selection of brushes that I'm working with, all my silver black velvets, which I love. I've got a number 2 and number 4 and a number 8. And I alternate between them constantly so that I have a clean one, wet one, smaller one. Now I'm just erasing the masking fluid and brushing it with a soft brush. Don't brush it with your hand. You can smudge things, you can put oil on the paper, and I've had paint on my hand before and I've smudged the paper horribly. So I've learnt through a lot of disasters to have a nice soft brush to brush away the masking fluid and erasing things. Thank you for watching.